Well, hello, everybody, and happy February. It's hard to believe we're already in February, but here we are. And today we're going to be talking about risk and mapping risk. And this has come up for a number of reasons. Number one is that the federal government has all of a sudden said to all critical infrastructure, hey, you need to do a better job of measuring your risk. We'll talk about this in the webinar, but we've seen prosecutions around this. We've seen fines around this. And the other thing is third-party risk, which people in the know has been an issue for a long time, is now, clearly front and center, as at least in some verticals, it has, third-party risk has overtaken email risk or direct breaches or direct attacks as the number one way that records get breached and ransomware criminals get in. So we're going to talk today about how to map your risk, how to measure it, what to do about it, and we're going to talk about third-party risk toward the end. If you don't know us, Critical Insight defends critical infrastructure. We help organizations prepare for a cyber attack, detect one, and respond decisively. And one of our partners is Cybersecurity. Steve Torino is joining us today. And Steve actually used to work with us on our staff and then left to go to CyberSaint. We're now partners with CyberSaint, and as we'll talk about today, have developed a really unique partnership that benefits our customers in a really nice way. Also joining the webinar today, Mike Hamilton, Fred Langston co-founded Critical Insight. Mike is currently our CISO, and Fred is our Chief Product Officer. And my name is Jake Milstein. I am the CMO and event host for Critical Insight. CMO is marketing, not medical, for those of you in healthcare. And I'm also the one who, I love interrupting these guys. And so put questions in the chat. I deeply love interrupting them and asking your questions. Now, we're going to get into the topic here in a second. There are a couple things you need to know. Number one, everybody who registered is going to get a recording. Number two, if you want the deck, we'll send out the deck and have it available for download. Or if you need it, if you need anything more quickly, just email me, jake@criticalinsight.com. And if people wouldn't mind, let us know where you're joining from. I think the furthest we've had somebody join from this year is Melbourne, Australia. So let us know where you're joining from. Would love to know. All right, Mike is going to start today. Mike, why don't you kick us off? What is risk?
What is it? Well, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot incorrectly. So when you do a vulnerability scan in your environment and you come up with a bunch of vulnerabilities and you say that's a risk and that's a risk, no, those are not risks. Those are vulnerabilities that you detected. When you are doing an assessment of your organization against a framework like NIST 800-53 or the cybersecurity framework or the PCI data security standard, and you have a missing control, a gap, and you say, oh, that's a risk. No, that's not a risk. That's a gap in your controls. Some threat actor coming after your hospital, and there's a lot of those right now, and in fact, they're proliferating. That's not a risk. That's a threat. Some likelihood of something happening without the context behind it. Yeah, that's not a risk. That is speculation. And it is certainly not a perfect science. And I have seen attempts to be very quantitative about risk. I'm a high, medium, low guy myself. I've seen a paper by Sun Microsystems a long time ago where they had like calculus to determine. It's not necessary to do that. It's not a perfect science, and there's no reason to get overly quantitative about it. What it is, it's this equation right here, and it's as simple as it can be. There's two parts: the likelihood of something bad happening and the consequence or the impact of that something bad. And when we talk about something bad, we got to pull ourselves out of the whole cyber narrative, because it's not about, Russians and buffer overflow and SQL injection and cross-site request forgery and all of that stuff. It's the business outcomes that you don't want, right? So it is unauthorized disclosure of records because that costs money, and we know how much money on average per record. So you can kind of quantify your risk there in terms of a dollar amount. Theft through business email compromise, which is a rapidly growing and already very bad problem. I think a lot of people saw the article. Someone in Hong Kong got fooled into transferring $25 million through business email compromise because they used a deep fake technique to do that. It was actually a video call. It wasn't email, but this is, again, proliferating. So theft is happening. Extortion, we all know about ransomware, denial of service, things like that. Pay us and we'll make it stop. We won't make your records public. There won't be a class action suit. That's all extortion. Disruption, which is becoming more frequent now because there's wars going on everywhere and everybody's cybered up. And so wipers are starting to show up. A lot of infrastructure in Ukraine just got wiped out, and Ukrainians did it to the Russians too. And then there's being that third party to attack your business associates. All right. So there's 5 things there that can go wrong that cost your business money. The likelihood that those will happen is reduced by applying preventive controls. Okay. Well, that's part of managing that risk. Once you've exhausted all of your methods for lowering that likelihood by firewalls, you train your users, manage your vulnerabilities, filter your email, all of that stuff, you're still a target. We're talking about people with high motivation and a lot of resources. You start to worry about that impact term. And minimizing impact is the narrative these days. It's not about keeping the bad guys out of your network. It's making sure you minimize downtime. That's what risk is, the product of those 2 things, likelihood and impact. And you multiply them together. And if they're both high, right, there's a high likelihood this is going to happen and the impact would be high, it's clearly high. But if you lowered your likelihood, but the impact would still be high, well, then that's still a medium risk. And that's kind of how this works. And you can get quantitative about it, but it's, in my mind, it's not necessary. Okay, so what are regulators? Jake brought up the fact that we're starting to get more and more regulatory pressure on the critical sectors, and that kind of thing has a tendency to cascade down to everybody else that's trying to do business with somebody who does business with the federal government. So if you're not a publicly traded corporation, this doesn't apply to you, but these are the narratives that are coming out. So they came out with this, 4-day mandatory reporting rule. Well, that's kind of what got everybody's attention. Oh my God, mandatory reporting. We're going to have to disclose things when we don't really understand. All right. Well, it's more than that. Here's what is really embedded in that SEC statement about that 4-day reporting. It's more about how you are managing risk and what kind of oversight is there from basically the C-suite of the corporation. All right, management has a role here. The board of directors have to have their fingerprints on how risk is managed. And so what this is trying to tell you is there's more to it than just deploy controls. It's manage the risk. And they want to know if you're using third parties to do this and how cyber risk has been integrated into a corporation's overall risk management strategy. Okay. Also in healthcare, right? So this is the hiccup. Healthcare and public sector cybersecurity framework implementation guide. They are saying approach cybersecurity as a risk management issue, right? You can't just say, IT, it's your baby. No, there has to be fingerprints all over these decisions. Understanding legal implications, because in today's world, and I'll get to one of those legal implications in here in a minute, there are lots of knock-on effects from these unauthorized disclosure of protected records, for example. It ends up in a class action suit, right? Regular board reporting. I just did the risk slide for our board meeting 2 days ago. It's got to be in the packet every time. And management is going to establish what we consider to be acceptable risk, for example, right? So you're out there trying to measure this stuff. And once you go, okay, I've determined that this is a medium risk, you're not done. You need to run that through some kind of governance organization, make sure that there are executive fingerprints on the decision, whether or not you want to accept, avoid, transfer, or mitigate that risk. And that is what is now being mandated toward the critical sectors. And again, this is likely going to cascade down on everybody. These are the
And hey,
recurring
and just hey,
themes.
Mike, and one quick thing
Yeah.
there, and for folks who are in healthcare, we're talking about healthcare there. Now they also have the CPGs. So,
Yeah.
um, for those of you in healthcare, that's the cybersecurity performance goals, which you have either heard of or haven't. But yeah, that's a whole new thing. And I see Andre asking, where would I find that guide? I can grab it and I'll put
Oh
the link
yeah,
in
if you
chat.
just Google
Oh,
that title, you'll
yeah, I'll
find it
grab it.
right away. And that's not, and that one is not the hiccup, the anti-CP. That's wrong. That's the implementation guide, and if you read through it, it's not a long read and it's very informative. Okay, so here's what's coming out, and I left out a bunch. There, TSA is doing it, EPA is doing it, HHS is doing it, the SEC is doing it. There will be others. Um, depending on what happens with, potentially the EPA's situation where they tried to say, okay, you need to do a cyber risk assessment along with your water quality testing. And a couple of states sued them and said that's an unfunded mandate. Anyway, set all that aside. The federal government is trying to regulate the critical sectors more, and we can expect to see more of this. So here are the recurring themes that are coming out of all of these statements coming out of what are called the sector-specific agencies that are directed at the critical sectors. Using the NIST cybersecurity framework and NIST 800-30, that means there is a standard of practice that they want you to align with. The NIST cybersecurity framework, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is probably the best tool to use. Risk assessment and risk management are very important. So risk assessment. So for example, using the NIST cybersecurity framework, and I'll give you a spreadsheet that is the NIST cybersecurity framework version 2 that will do spider charts for you and all that stuff. Just ask for it. We'll send it to you. They want you to not only align with that framework, but then you have to go that extra step. If a control is missing, based on the fact that the control is missing, what is the likelihood that you will lose records, have money stolen, be extorted, et cetera, right? And then what would the impact of that be? So you turn a missing control into actual risk, okay? So that's what they mean about risk management as opposed to just assessment. Now you have to go through the governance organization and say, we recommend that we mitigate this risk with controls. And your governance organization is free to say, no, we will accept that risk. And now those executive fingerprints are on there, and it wasn't your decision to make. And that's the right way to do it. Third-party risk management is coming up everywhere. We're going to talk about that. Mandatory reporting is coming up everywhere. Why? Because the federal government wants telemetry out there to know exactly what's happening so that we can understand, are there systemic things that we can address? Is there a sector under attack? Like right now, we know it's water and energy because the FBI keeps coming out and saying, well, the Chinese have been in our energy infrastructure for 5 years. Right? Governance, again, that committee that you use to adjudicate findings of risk, continuous monitoring. These themes keep coming up over and over and over. We are here largely to talk about risk management, but there are penalties for not doing it right. And this is starting to show up more. So here you can see Gartner predicted 3 in 4 CEOs, 75% will be held personally liable. Well, we're starting to see now negligence coming up as a consequence for not managing risk appropriately, mostly to include that committee, that risk governance committee, where you're getting executive fingerprints and leadership participating in these decisions. So don't let this happen to you. And I believe Fred, you want to take this one on?
Sure. So let's talk mechanically how you can approach this. We won't talk about methodology. There are a lot of ways to approach it, but let's talk mechanically because I spent years, started out in 2005 developing risk assessment tools for Microsoft, then did this for US Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. Years developing tools, and all those tools back then were built on a spreadsheet. So you can start out, you can do this with a pen and paper, right? That you can actually print out forms or put a template down, follow the template, enter content in. Not a bad way to do it. In fact, you may be writing your risk assessment report in real time if you do it appropriately. You can also move to, like I said, a tool. But there are varying levels and capabilities of tools. The government has long put out an Excel or a couple of different Excel spreadsheets to assess risk. Ironically, one of the reasons they said to move to the NIST cybersecurity framework is those tools were not working well. They were not working as expected. They were not flexible enough. And you run into one significant problem. If you're putting a bunch of text into a cell, it won't fit if it's over a certain size. So it's difficult to use as a reporting tool, but it may be useful if you're thinking about a qualitative approach where you're marking what you think the probabilities are, what you think the impacts will be. Maybe you have some sliding scale you built in there, and then you have it calculate risk, as Mike said, in a relatively straightforward fashion, and eventually end up with some method to have a qualitative or semi-quantitative approach to here's how we're measuring risk here. So it begins to look a lot more repeatable than pen and paper, which is very much the art of the assessor, right? Who is running it? What do they believe is important, and how are they structuring that? If you have something in a tool like an Excel spreadsheet, you now have a semi-repeatable process. And if you are able to build more logic in, you may be able to eliminate some of the, let's say, the art of making an assessment of risk or probability or impact. Probably the way I think most people will eventually be moving to is move to a GRC platform. Could be something in-house. I'd suggest actually using a software as a service, so you're not managing yet another set of infrastructure on what could be a relatively complex platform, because they're going to collect and manage a lot of data. This is incredibly useful because it adds usually a level of automation to the process, where you can then delegate specific parts of an assessment to other team members, and you don't have to go and run an interview. You have to set things up. It can all be done through emails and using maybe particular repositories like a Box or Dropbox, secure business account. So putting all these things together makes it so people can work on a risk assessment platform any time of day or night. It's available for them. They don't have to wait for somebody to come interview them. They're able to update data in real time, and you're able to run reports that literally reflect where you're at in a point in time. So we're seeing the world kind of filling a need here by making this very complex approach with a lot of content to manage much more repeatable, much more automatable, and frankly, I think much more powerful, because now we're getting the capabilities to do true risk assessment within a SaaS platform. That is relatively new capability to do that well. And finally, we believe those capabilities are out there. So this is where the world's been and where the world's going. Ultimately, what do we suggest? The NIST cybersecurity framework. And why we've said this if you've been to any of our NIST-based webinars, but it is outcome-based, right? Meaning it can be a true one-size-fits-all. A positive outcome for a small business is very different than the same positive outcome for a multinational corporation. This makes it much more easy to apply and much more flexible for you when you're assessing your organization, because then you could talk about how you do it and then how that addresses the particular risk that you're after. And in particular, the NIST cybersecurity framework, especially with the new governance in 2.0, is telling you you have to do everything here. And if you're not doing this in an organized fashion where you can attest to all these columns, all these requirements in the govern column, a platform makes a whole bunch of sense now that you have to actually put all this into a framework and report it up.
Yeah, let me just break in too, and just
sure.
One thing that I don't know is that we're going to make obvious enough is when you're using the platform to manage your risk, right? And so you understand and you set what the likelihood is that, you know, and what the impact would be. What it does is it allows you to take it that next step and go, what's it going to cost to fix this? And so what you end up with is your durable information that you've put in, so that you can do, you know, year-on-year checking. It gives you a corrective action roadmap, or what's called a POAM, right? What is POAM?
Plan of action.
Plan of action, right? And action milestones, right?
Yeah.
But also budget that out. so that it becomes extremely useful in the budgeting process, right? So you understand what your corrective actions are going to cost. And that's the kind of thing you take to your committee and go, nah, it's going to be too expensive. We'll accept that risk. But again, that's the process you need to take it through. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, Steve, take it away.
All right. Before I jump into the Cybersecurity screenshots here, just wanted to mention a couple other points about the CSF. I live in this world every day. So one of the great things that makes it really flexible, as we kind of touched on here already, is that each of these categories that we're showing here, the level beneath them is the subcategories. They're not controls themselves, but NIST provides you, based on whatever industry you're in or whatever your preferred sort of control set to assess yourself against are, with informative references to these. So it's really flexible to be able to choose the appropriate controls that make the most sense for your business. Another thing I like about this framework, and this is true about the version 1.1 as well, is the scoring methodology that they use. They call it the implementation tiers. That actually includes certain aspects of kind of process maturity, which is really some of what Mike was going through in the earlier slides around the governance requirements with the SEC. The CSF implementation tiers can kind of help you analyze some of that as well. So starting off here, this first screenshot, and by the way, these capabilities, Cybersecurity has our own way of doing it. You don't necessarily have to use Cybersecurity. There's a lot of other tools out there. Some of this stuff you could, leverage within spreadsheet functionality as well. We think within the tool just brings a lot of transparency and automation, just by automating workflows and being able to have multiple users in there, as we touched on before, assigning out different aspects of an assessment to different stakeholders. This first screenshot is showing the executive dashboard. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is for that first chart up there on the left-hand side, that's your top industry cybersecurity risks. Finding that this information actually took a really long time. We went to all the sources where you would have expected to have this stuff. We went to the Sector Coordinating Council, we went to NIST, we went to MITRE, we went to CIS. None of them seemed to have it, or if they did, they weren't sharing it. So we found this company called Advisen, and you can go and purchase a license yourself to this data set. But what Advisen has been doing is tracking for decades cyber losses, right, for different events. And they've kind of sliced and diced it such that you can compare yourself against organizations in your same industry, similar in size in terms of your revenue, as well as your employee count. And so what it allows you to do is kind of, first of all, benchmark, because I think a question that's coming up more often when we're presenting metrics to leadership, right, about the different resourcing capabilities and stuff that we need to solve some of these problems, is they are asking about the math. Like, where are you getting that from? What assumptions have you made that lead you to believe that our risk is this high? And, are our competitors paying as much money to remediate some of this stuff as well? This is just a best practices kind of data set that you can point to and say, benchmarked against similar sized companies in our same industry, this is what we're seeing across the board. You can juxtapose that next to, on the right, what your top cybersecurity risks are. That's the benefit of having a risk register in the system. You can change these inputs, right? You can, if you think your risk is higher or lower, you're free to include numbers that will demonstrate that if you'd like. But at a minimum, it gives you kind of a defensibility to the numbers that you're providing based on this historical data set. This one here, I'm going to focus on the graphic on the right here. This is a screenshot from our NIST 830 risk tracking. So we have multiple risk frameworks in the system that you can use to analyze your risk. One of the things that's nice about NIST 830 is it's a little more qualitative. It does bring in some aspects of risk quantification based on likelihood and impact figures that can be informed by things like the Advisen data set. But what it's going to provide you with is a pretty typical heat map like this that's on a scale, in this case, of 5 by 5, so a 25 scale, of where your risks lie in each of these categories here. You can then leverage just the NIST 830 methodology by itself if you'd like, or what we have some customers doing is using NIST 830 to list all of their risks in, and then taking, let's say, their top 5, their top 10 that they're the most concerned about, and running that through an analysis with FAIR. So this is going from qualitative to much more quantitative. The key, though, is whenever you're talking about risk quantification, then what you're getting out of it is only as good as what you're putting into it. So if the assumptions that you're making about how frequently these things happen or how much they're going to cost when they do happen is inaccurate, and there is a tendency, I've seen a lot of these registers, a lot of times people guess There are some cases where there's data that you could pull to substantiate your decisions. Like let's take phishing, for example. There's some statistics out there that something like 17% of phishing emails result in a click-through, and of that 17%, 12% result in some type of negative consequence, usually malware. So you could say, all right, well, that equates to math around like 2% of phishing emails are going to result in a negative consequence. So you can back into it in some cases like that. But the thing that's really helpful with having the advising data set is informing the inputs that you're putting into the FAIR analysis. FAIR is really, really powerful. I would recommend, if you're going to use it, to buy the book. There is actually a book on FAIR, and I'll put the name in the chat when I'm done talking here. Just to really understand what you're working with. It uses Monte Carlo simulations to run, a couple thousand permutations based on the inputs, and delivers you back these kind of risk distribution and loss curves that can be really helpful in making your case as a InfoSec person trying to gather resources and explaining to the board why you're recommending the level of resourcing that you're actually asking for.
And notice that risk is reported in terms of dollars, because if you're going to have a conversation with leadership of a corporation or a company or a hospital or a local government or whatever, right? Our risk is 9.2 means nothing. Right. This whole 0 to 10 scale, or even high, medium, low, right, is probably, even a little harder to wrap your head around for some people. But when you report it out in terms of dollars to the business, it makes a lot of sense, because this is how risk management is done for all the other risks, right? Okay. The risk of customer attrition, the risk of being struck by an asteroid, right? It all equates to dollars.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard to make your case for the dollars that you need if you can't show what the potential loss is, and have that be informed by sources and information that makes sense and that people trust.
Or if the loss is catastrophic, like an asteroid, then we're all dead.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, there's a funny irony here where, Andre had asked in the chat about, companies getting fined. And obviously, we've now seen, CISOs and other folks, going on trial, or at least facing civil, suits and all of that. And so, for folk, I'm looking at the titles of most of the folks in the webinar, for you, you have to prove to the business that there's ROI to security. Meanwhile, your own personal ROI is, I want to show that I did everything I could to prevent risk.
That's actually one of the great things about FAIR too, because if you dig into it, if you read the book and you see how the equation is kind of generated there with the Monte Carlo simulations, they have inputs for things like secondary losses, right, which can be regulatory and legal fees and things like that, reputational loss. So it's a powerful system. Yeah,
and I talked to an IT director who was looking at some of the prosecution against the SolarWinds CISO, and said, I feel personally attacked. Like, some of the stuff, like, all right, he might not have done that perfectly well, but other things, like, really, we're going to charge this guy? So yeah, it goes back and forth. And also, Andre asked the question of, are there fines? That are we seeing, what he said, are we seeing any enforcement of regulatory agencies before an incident?
Right.
And Mike, you said, not really, because federal government doesn't have thousands of auditors. It usually comes after. Absolutely. But also in other industries, we have. I mean, we've seen some enforcement in banking. That happens, before, when somebody doesn't do well in an audit, or when a customer feels wronged and sues, and that opens up, the organization. Famously, Wells Fargo had employees that were, making fake accounts. That was found by a customer and then became a thing. So, it wasn't a breach, but people.
Well, there's also how, the federal government does it with the GAO. So when I say the federal government doesn't have, thousands of auditors to go out and check water utilities and dam operations and things like this, they do check their own agencies. And so in that case, when there's all these requirements coming from the federal government for the federal agencies, the GAO does go in and go, okay, you're not really coming along with this stuff. They can't find them. They just publicly, shame them to Congress, and then we just keep going like we go.
Another federal example I was going to throw out there was the DoD, because in the defense industrial base, that's a little bit different. They have to show their papers first in order to qualify to bid on contracts. And there are examples of like false claim acts and stuff that's been brought against folks. That actually was an issue when CMMC first started coming out, because the DoD said they would help cover some of the expenses for the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, to comply with CMMC. But it's a little bit tricky if you've been attesting on NIST 800-171 that you have all your papers together, and then you're going and asking for money to remediate things you should have probably done before. So slippery slope.
Right. All right, Steve. Why don't you keep going? We got.
Yep. Moving right along.
I promised folks we would also get the third-party risk, so I got to listen for that.
All right, let's do it. All right, last screenshot here is around risk remediation. So this is kind of where it all comes back to the discussions with other stakeholders, right? So you've done your risk assessment, you understand what your risks are, you understand what your exposure is, but then you want to treat that risk, right? And so typically you can treat risk by either accepting it, you can avoid it, you can transfer it through insurance, or you can mitigate it. This screenshot here is just an example, and I'm just noticing that in the demo environment, we have a negative return on security investment. Ideally, you'd want it to be the other way around, but you never want to, when you understand what your risks are, and you're trying to mitigate them, you want to back into, there's going to be a point at which it doesn't make financial sense to mitigate them, right? So if the solution costs more than what the risk is, it's not really a good indication that that's something that you should buy or something that you should do. Typically, you can look at remediation in different buckets, right? People, process, technology, for example. Some of the people process things can be a little bit cheaper. You need to get a policy, procedures in place. If you're going to do that, though, make sure you follow the policy and procedure, because that gets into the whole negligence thing that Mike covered earlier. But this just kind of allows you to do some financial analysis based on the risks that you've identified, how you want to mitigate them, and what the financials look like to kind of make that case to different stakeholders across the organization. So with that, Jake, I think we can move to third party.
All right, and I also want to tell folks, if you have questions as we go through this, don't be afraid to put them in the chat. Happy to answer questions. But Fred, I think it's important to also talk about third party risk here, because you're not just measuring your risk; you need to measure your third party's risk. And I talked about this at the top, but a lot of people joined as we were going, so I'm gonna add this, which is we look at. So we work with a number of different industries. One of the ones we work with the most is healthcare. And we do an analysis every year of healthcare breaches. And one of the things we found was, if you go back a couple of years, the number one ways the bad guys got in was through email. And that is no longer the case. The number one way the bad guys get in is through third parties. And when I say get in, the HHS numbers don't really measure, they don't measure ransomware, they measure records stolen. And so that's really the measure there that we're talking about, which is one of the reasons third parties is so important. Fred, to you, sir.
Yeah. So what really is third party risk management? Well, ultimately, you need to figure out out of maybe dozens, potentially hundreds of people that are providing services, everything from your cloud providers to people coming in doing maintenance on your air conditioning, and everyone in between is potentially has access to your data or your systems that have that data. And almost all regulatory regimes at this point require you to assess the risk, manage that risk, and most importantly, usually, is pass those requirements that you have to protect data down to your third parties. Now, what is a third party? Well, it's any of those vendors, but now it also includes what they call fourth party or even fifth party or more risk. A fourth party is a third party of a third party. So if we are using a particular, for example, a provider of backup services in the cloud, that is our third party, and they're using Amazon to store their data, that is our fourth party, and we need to understand that risk. So it is a requirement now to have a program to understand the risks that move all the way down your supply chain. It's not good enough to say, hey, I required my vendor to do it. You need to ask how they're doing third-party risk management to understand your fourth-party risk. So this is a very tricky slippery slope. You don't want to overburden your vendors, right? You have to be fair. Can't cost them more than your contract to participate and go through your assessment program. Yet you need a way to effectively and consistently assess. You may lean into a governing body, right? There are some bodies that you can get certified against, and maybe that is the measuring stick you use. But that doesn't normally scale as well, and it's certainly not good if you're a smaller provider. So the thing we need to look at is, how do we approach this kind of on a systematic way to build a program that works for you, right? For your organization. So the way people look at this is it can be completely self-service, right? We send out a survey. Maybe we use SurveyMonkey, for example. Maybe we use Cybersecurity, maybe, or something like that. We use an approach where we ask them to fill out information, maybe attest to the veracity of that information, and then potentially ask them to continue, once they are awarded a contract, to maintain that information in perpetuity as long as the contract is alive. That is a very, very reasonable approach. It again takes a lot of the burden away, but it needs you to set it up and understand some very important components I'm going to talk about in a minute that are part of the program. So like, can be just purely something online where you have your people are kind of facilitating it and vetting the answers, right? They're not trusting. Maybe your third parties, they're maybe wanting to dig in a little bit deeper when they're going through this. They want an interactive approach to this. And then maybe it's something as formal as an on-site audit. That may be really important if the physical security of their data center is everything you care about. Because if somebody breaks in, or somebody were to burn that to the ground, that is going to put you out of business. That might be something you want to do an on-site audit. So understanding what you're trying to achieve here is very important to how you build out the approach that you're going to use.
And just one thing that happened last year here is, even if it doesn't let the bad guys get, as Fred just pointed out, even if it doesn't let the bad guys into your system, it can still impact you. As an example, there was so for small credit unions, they don't want to have their own ATMs. They don't want to go buy their own ATMs and service their own ATMs, and so they outsource that. And there's a company, and I cannot remember the name of the company, but they got hit by ransomware. And so what happened was, for I think hundreds of small credit unions across the Midwest, all of their ATMs stopped working. Was their customer data taken? No. Did it cause ransomware for them? No. Was it a big problem? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I have to follow up with a great example from 2022. One of the largest breaches, 22 million records, healthcare records, ultimately didn't come from a healthcare provider. Came from a medical collections company. Yep. They hit one medical collections company, 22 million records, and hundreds of hospitals all had to report as if their data were breached. What's the bigger irony here? This particular provider not only did not do a HIPAA risk assessment, even though they were required to, they're under GLBA, which requires a risk assessment as well. Those are two of the main laws that absolutely require risk assessment and not just gap analysis. So they were afoul of both of those for the largest breach in 2022.
And think of the size of the target that they represent, right? It's health records and financial data together. Right. But they should have known that you're a huge target.
Yeah. So what kind of goes into this? Well, you got to build the program, right? It's a design effort. What do you want to measure people against? How are you going to do that? And then we're going to execute the program. And then we got to maintain that program because things change, right? Requirements change. The threat horizon changes. How are you going to stay up with the current threats that your third parties are facing? So first thing is, you got to build something, right? You got to align maybe with something, maybe a framework, or maybe you're going to look and say, hey, I have got 4 tiers of vendors. I've got people that are like janitors, janitorial services, people that do maintenance on hardware, things like that. They have physical access to things. That's a low bar, but I have people that are basically processing my most precious data. That's the highest bar. So you probably create a standard. Here's all the things I want from my most critical vendors. And then you start eliminating portions of that for the lesser vendors or the ones that have lesser risk profiles. And you get down to something that's maybe 5 questions for the janitorial service and maybe is 100 questions for your enterprise customers. So you build a format and you build a measuring stick, a standard. Like I said, I like to build one and then pair back, but you can build separate ones for each if you decide. But you have to build your measuring sticks, right? And you have to understand who you're going to apply them to, and you're going to have to understand what is measuring, what is an effective measurement, what is a passing grade, what is not passing, right? How do you draw the line? I do not want to do business with that vendor because of this, or I'm going to require you, vendor, to provide this level of assurance that you fix these problems, right? So you need to have policies around this. You need to understand how you're going to execute this. How is this going to fit into your procurement process, right? This is the pointy tip of the security spear in third-party world is all about procurement, right? That's where this all starts. If you have not led with this stuff in procurement, you can't come backwards, or it's really hard to come backwards and try to shoehorn it into existing contracts. So,
including contract language, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the contract language is as critical. As a matter of fact, that is your method of fourth-party risk management. And if you have things like HIPAA that says you need a business associate agreement, that is the archetype for you need to have an agreement with your third parties that they're going to carry out the same level of security that you will to protect your consumer or your healthcare data. So again, then you need to have a program to run this stuff. So you need people to do the initial assessment process, score risk. There needs to be a body or some decision maker that says it's a go or no. We're not going forward. The risk is too high. Got to have that because it's a risk-based decision, right? That's what we're doing. We're managing risk here. Then you need a way to monitor things through time. The threats change. People's environments may be changing on monthly, maybe daily if you're in the cloud. You need to understand how these risks are changing. And then you need to be able to say, wow, this particular vendor has fallen so far behind on remediating all the controls we required them to do when we signed the contract. We need to terminate this arrangement, and potentially it might even be a breach of contract situation. And the worst case scenario is having your IR plan has to build into it now. How do I deal with third parties? How do I work with notifications? What requirements do they have to notify me so I can notify the SEC, for example, in my 72-hour window? Very complex thing. So you have to consider all these in your third-party risk management program.
I did hear an attorney refer to the degrees of separation once as the Kevin Bacon theory of needing to tell people what happened in a breach.
Correct.
And I will say, and I act as the CISO here, and one thing I am extremely proud of is that I have denied Jake certain vendors because they just didn't pass muster.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a marketing vendor. It's always a marketing vendor.
Yeah, and it is always a marketing vendor. I will,
the creepy
as the guy who runs marketing, I can tell you there are a lot of marketing vendors that you should not use as your third parties, and you should take a look at what your marketing teams are using. And absolutely true. I've talked to many marketing leaders about this. Buying the latest, greatest stuff does not mean you're buying the greatest security technology. I will also take this moment to say, there are 2 things that Mike has produced that if folks want, let me know. I'm happy to send them to you. Number 1 is if Jake wants a vendor and Mike is like, ooh, they don't have a SOC 2 type 2, I have a questionnaire that I'm going to send them, and Mike sends them a voluminous questionnaire that they have to fill out that they never do, and then Jake can't use them. But if you want the questionnaire, you can have Mike's questionnaire. And second, as earlier, Mike talked about the spreadsheet the NIST CSF spreadsheet. If folks want that, happy to send that along as well. That's more useful than the other one, because the other one you could just deny your marketing vendors.
Hey, just to jump in on that questionnaire thing, I see a lot of these things because I fill them out for our customers. I have to review them for our vendors, and I also have received custom ones all the time from our customers to put into the system. There are some out there that are kind of like industry standard ones. You could point to like the CAC, you could point to, Cloud Security Alliance, like HECVAT is a good one for higher education. If you don't have a questionnaire yet, you should use Mike's. But if you don't use Mike's, then you might think about standardizing. Sometimes it can also really help with procurement process because a lot of times your vendors may have already filled that one out for other customers of theirs, and you can kind of use it multiple times.
Yeah. One of the challenges with that can be that a lot of the open standards eventually become for pay certification standards. I personally built a few of those in the financial industry that are now very expensive services that used to be free. So that's kind of the downside. If you get on board with one and it's really successful, probably going to go private at some point. So.
Oh, all right. So, all right, Mike, we're going to start charging for your spreadsheet. They're no longer open source. I'm just kidding. All right, Fred, you want to talk about virtual CISO stuff?
Sure. So how can you manage risk if this is something that you've never done before? You need to at least get a program built. You need to have somebody to guide you. It is not for the faint of heart. It's something that has so many differing components to it that, like I mentioned, you have to pull together contracts, procurement, IT, vendor management. What happens when people are out of compliance, right? This is a complete program with all aspects of a business. It's not just a security function. So you need somebody that wants to manage this program, that has the expertise to manage that. I would recommend bring in an expert. The perfect role for this is your virtual CISO, because the CISO is usually a designated role to take on third-party risk management and overall risk assessment and risk management for an organization. So put somebody in there that can put together the most appropriate plan that's going to take advantage of your budget. Having somebody in there that understands how to speak to the board, absolutely critical. This is a board level communication. If you can get past the CFO and you can speak past even the CEO, and you can become somebody who can actually advise the board, then you can give them some critical business information that comes from the top, that then supports budget, supports the mission of the organization, and builds the culture you need to have. So bringing somebody in here that knows how to do this structure building within your organization is a key component of this, because it's not just a one and done. It's not just a pen test annually. It's all this stuff rolled together, and it has to be operated effectively, has to be reported on. You should have KPIs. It should be fully managed, right? So what's the other thing, as Mike says, this should all be about, how you're managing risk, which means you can transfer it, right, to insurance, right? You can accept it, right? You can mitigate risk, right? So there are ways to do it, and you should have a formalized approach. Have somebody make sure that everybody is adhering and understands that formalized approach to how we, at this company, your company, we handle risks. This is how we do it. We understand how we're managing all these, and we can explain to a regulator how we're doing it, because they're the ones that come in and give you the grade and maybe fine you if you're not in compliance. Mike, as Mike says, and as we all that live this space know, I want more than my fingerprints on any of this. I want a committee that I report everything I understand and learn to them, and we all agree on the disposition of that risk. It's a group decision. It's an informed decision. Everybody is on the same page. It's not a mystery, and we're not hiding things from anyone, right? The whole thing here is really to build a culture that says this is critically important to manage these risks, because other businesses like us go out of business. They get mortally wounded. They have their stock price knocked down 15%, any one of these terrible outcomes, right? So you're going to make sure that people are understanding this is not more than just doing this because I have to, that this is a valuable tool that we're going to apply to our business to make sure we remain profitable and we continue to grow moving forward. And the underlying for this, right, what does it always come down to, folks? It comes down to money, right? It's about budget, right? What do we do? How do we get it? How do we justify that budget? As we said, risk assessment, there is no better tool to justify budget. because you're really telling them, okay, if you don't spend it, you're going to lose 10x. And that is a very common number. Protection is usually about 10 times less to pay for protection than it is for the actual bad impacts and outcomes, right? So quantifying this and saying, look, this isn't, I'm not making this up. This is, from people that have been collecting this data, is becoming finally actuarial style data, right? Like the insurance companies, they know what happens if you drive your car down the street, whether your chances of an accident are going to be, right? Based on your mileage per year or something like that.
Oh,
They know there's a 100-year charts. Well, we're finally getting there with this. So this is a kind of a new horizon for us that we can actually use.
And hey, Fred, when you think about, but everybody, most people have cyber insurance at this point, right? And the cyber insurance companies are now giving cyber insurance carriers are now giving everybody a questionnaire, right? I've now seen a 22 questionnaire, and I've seen a 2200 question. No, it's not 220 questionnaire. I haven't seen 2200. But so, how, we've talked about all these ways to map risk. We've talked about, with Steve, how you do it in a platform. We've talked about how you do it in a spreadsheet. How does that inform insurance? Like if somebody comes to one of the folks who's here and they say, hey, all right, now that you're doing this, is there an ROI in insurance? Like, can we see our insurance costs go down? Is there a correlation there?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, so I was doing vCISO work for a publicly traded corporation, and we put all of the documentation together of their controls and assessed them against the NIST framework, and did basically what we just said here. And when they took that to their insurer at the time of their renewal, they saved $400,000.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a big corporation. So, yeah, you can move the needle with this, especially, you're showing them that you have the programmatics in place to do this. It's not a one and done. We do this continuously, and that is a good reason to outsource it, because that way, you're not losing a resource that you need to apply elsewhere, and put them on this, and you don't need to hire somebody to do it. But showing that it's durable and that you're going to repeat it every year, and that you have a corrective action plan, you've quantified, what it's going to cost to remediate, and you have that governance committee to put fingerprints on it. That all reflects really well when you're shopping for insurance.
Yeah, question number one is, do you have a risk management program in place, right? And that's exactly what Mike's describing. And most people say, sure, we think about that.
Yeah, we do vulnerability
Probably
scans.
Probably shouldn't be checking yes to that.
Actually, question one is, when was your last ransomware attack? I just got the latest questionnaire from one of the carriers. That's actually question one. Wow. So when we think about these things, look, obviously, I'm going to go to a slide I wanted to didn't end up in here. But when we talk about these things, one of the things that we think about is how do you what can you do yourself, and then what do you need help with? Fred just talked about getting a vCISO to help with this if you can't do it on your own. So Fred and obviously you can get a platform and then get help with the platform. So Fred and Steve, how do you guys think about what you should do yourself in an organization and what you should go get help with? Steve, why don't you start that, and then we'll go to Fred.
Yeah, I think, one question that we get asked fairly often from prospects and customers when we're going through these security questionnaires is, do you have a dedicated information security function, right? Because everybody knows if it's somebody kind of multi-purposed and doing that on nights and weekends or something, you're not going to be getting the full kind of programmatic benefits that you would if somebody's really focused on it. Realistically, CISOs are a high cost employee, and it may not be necessary in organizations of all sizes to have a full-time one on staff, right? It can be very effective to have a fractional or virtual CISO who can handle especially some of the governance stuff, right? Because that individual's at the level where they're reporting and communicating directly with senior leadership and the board. And ultimately, the effectiveness of a security program, we touched on it a couple of times here, I think, but it has to be ingrained in the culture. So it has to come from the top down. They need to be informed of what the risks actually are. They need to be involved in making decisions about what's the acceptable level of risk. And a VCSO is an excellent way to handle that.
Yeah, and Fred, how do you think about that when you advise companies and folks?
Yeah. So here's how I kind of look at it. Having been paid really large sums of money by major enterprise corporations to build spreadsheet tools that are effective for risk assessment, I will tell you, do not. If you use a spreadsheet, it should be a very rudimentary, very qualitative approach to risk assessment. Don't overcomplicate. Because it's much better to go out and get a platform. Don't do it yourself. People solve these problems. It's becoming a mature space. So take advantage of what the world's built. It's going to make your life vastly simple.
Just kind of anecdotally, we've seen some of these complicated spreadsheets and been asked to kind of like build it into our platform. It's pretty frequent that we actually find math errors in those. The more complex it is, the more likely it is to not actually be telling you what you think.
Yep. Yeah. And just let me pile on that too. So what do you do yourself versus what do you outsource? It is not difficult to go through the mechanics of doing this, especially, open up the spreadsheet and start answering questions, right? That's at the low end, that's what it is. But establishing the programmatics, establishing a durable, repeatable methodology for doing this, and then handing it off to the organization, because then you can do this stuff. The governance meetings are set up. We have an agenda. We know what it's going to be. A risk register has been set up. Outsource that stuff, put it all in place, and then you run it. That's what I think.
And so Daniel puts a question in the chat here. And as I answer it, we're getting toward the end of time here. So I'm going to put our survey in the end. I would appreciate if everybody took the survey. Let us know if this was helpful. And I'm going to answer Daniel's question here. He says, how often are you seeing cyber insurance companies not paying out from a cyber threat due to not resolving some risk that you indicated? I just heard of one of these cases, but it was pretty clear. Right. What had happened was that the organization had said, we have 2FA on everything, and it just wasn't true. And so I think what they've tried to do in the questionnaires, and this is why you have 220 questionnaires, is they try to drill down on things so they can prove that you lied on one thing. But there are a bunch of famous cases where the insurance companies have tried to get out of or have gotten out of paying. Especially on business email compromises where somebody just wires away money and they're like, oh yeah, that wasn't covered because, you told us you were, using this for email and you weren't, or, something like that. So, I think that's, I have seen that come up a lot.
The answer is not infrequently.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So we're going to do final thoughts here in a second. I do want to say one thing about, some of the things we talked about here, which is, when we think about some of the services here, we provide VCSOs. We help people build third-party risk management programs. We provide managed detection response. And with that, if you're one of our customers, you get the CyberSaint platform as part of that. But we can also help you work with Steve and get the CyberSaint platform on your own. It is much better than using Mike's spreadsheet. I will send you Mike's spreadsheet, and the platform is better. All right, don't forget to take the survey. Let's do final thoughts here. We're going to go Steve, Fred, and then Mike. Steve, final thoughts.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. This has been fun. I think the key is with a lot of this risk assessment stuff that it needs to be flexible, right? That's why we have multiple models and systems so that you can choose the one that works the best for you. And you always got to start somewhere. Doing something, even if it's not perfect, is better than doing nothing. So if you want to start out in the spreadsheet and then grow into a platform, that's a perfectly reasonable way to approach it.
Fred, final thought.
Yeah, this is one area where experience really does count. So if you can find somebody to assist you, consult with you, get this program built and get your standards built out, that's the fast track. I think, to getting a program online.
All right, Mike, final thoughts.
If you have 1 million records in a database and they meet the definition of personally identifiable information, protected health information, we know that those records are worth somewhere between $200 and $400 a piece to clean up after a records disclosure. And if that is something that you measure to be at medium risk, then you have a potential liability of $150 million there. Can I have $50,000 in controls to deploy to cut that risk in half again? I get $75 million of risk reduction for an outlay of $50,000. That's how to have the conversation. The Russians are coming and buffer overflow is scary. That's not how to do it.
Dollars and cents.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to take the survey. We really appreciate you having here.
Yep.
If you need anything, send me an email, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I will send folks the spreadsheets that you requested. All right, everybody. Talk to you
See
soon.
y'all later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. See you, Steve.
See ya.
Bye.